So the story of David and Bathsheba is actually a really disturbing story. And it's funny because I think in popular culture, if anyone has heard of this story, they've heard that it's a sexy story. But when you actually read it, and we've heard glimpses of it this morning, we did some of the high-level snippets, but when you read especially the 2 full chapters of this story, and I invite you to go home and do that later, when you really read this story, it is so disturbing. First of all, it's about sexual exploitation. Because let's not make a mistake here, Bathsheba is summoned to David by his men. She doesn't exactly have a choice whether to sleep with him or not. Then there's an unwanted pregnancy. Then there's all of this effort to cover that up and send Uriah here and there, but Uriah is just too honorable to fall into those traps. And so then Uriah, in his honor and his innocence, is murdered on the front lines of war, along with the folks who are fighting next to him. And then, of course, there is this deeply disturbing part of the story where God murders an innocent baby just to get back at David to punish him for all of these sins. As modern readers of this story, heck, as any readers of this story, this is a disturbing story on many levels. But before we start pulling it apart, I do want to make one theological point clear, and it has to do with that last part, this idea that God would kill an innocent baby just to get back at its parents. I actually take issue with the writer of this story theologically with that, and you're allowed to do that when you read the Bible, by the way. You are allowed to wrestle with the Bible and with its authors when you read the Bible. I take theological issue with this idea that God would kill an innocent baby just to get back at its parents. To me, it doesn't make theological sense because I believe that God values the sanctity of each and every life equally, and so I can't imagine that God would take one life just to teach another person a lesson. Or let me put it this way, I hope I myself am not somehow killed by a bus just to teach somebody else a lesson, right? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, especially the innocent life of a baby. I just can't believe in a God that would do that to prove a point. But I do think that this story is here for a reason to prove a point to all of us as faithful readers of Scripture. I think this story is here to prove a lot of super important points to us as faithful readers of Scripture. And the central point that I see threaded throughout every twist and moment of deception and darkness of this story, one of the central themes that jumps out to me is this. For every sin that we commit, there are a whole lot of innocent people who get caught in the crossfire. For every big mistake that we make in life, there are a whole lot of people who are collateral damage to that sin. If you think about it, David just has this one moment. He's admittedly supposed to be out fighting wars, but he's lazy, stays back home where the other kings are out fighting. He lets other people do the dirty work. It's when he's being lazy, he's hanging back at home. He has one big mistake rooted in his own desire for Bathsheba. And look at the ripple effects that happen from that one instance of sin, the ripple effects going out, the murder, the death, the destruction, the loss of life, the loss of innocence. It's huge just from that one act. I think that's one of the big lessons that we are invited to take away from this story, that every sin has an enormous amount of ripple effects, collateral damage, people caught in the crossfire. But here's another thing that I see in this story too. David is so blind to that. David is so blind to all of the effects of that sin. It's not until the prophet Nathan calls him out on it that he even begins to recognize his own guilt. When the prophet Nathan forces him to see what he's done, that he even has a shred of remorse. And I think that's actually pretty true to life. I think that most of us avoid at all cost owning the full gravity of the mistakes that we make. Now, many of us haven't done the kind of thing that David has done, but almost all of us have made mistakes in our life. And how often are we invited to recognize the full effect of those mistakes, to sit and wonder about all the people that we might have hurt indirectly from the mistakes that we've made. Our culture today teaches us not to do that. Lawyers will tell you never to do that. Don't ever admit fault. Don't ever admit mistakes. Just deny, deflect, or take a note from David and put on blinders and don't even look for it. In the end of the story, the only life that David actually ends up mourning is the life of that baby. He doesn't lament that Bathsheba has lost a husband and a child. He doesn't lament that Uriah is dead or the men fighting with him. David only has one tiny bit of remorse for the child who dies because of his actions. And I think that in a lot of ways, sometimes we do that too. We'll see a small piece of the harm we might have caused by a mistake or a sin, but we just can't take in the full effect. And I think the reason is because we are afraid. We're afraid of if we really look and see all the people that we might have hurt indirectly from the mistakes we made, we just aren't sure how we could ever overcome that. We aren't sure how we could ever find a way forward, repair those relationships, enjoy a life beyond that. We are just feeling like if we see the enormity of the debt we might owe, we just don't know how that could ever be repaid. But here in this story, too, we do have one glimpse at hope in that circumstance. We see one glimpse of light that David has as well. See, when the prophet Nathan is telling David to see the full extent of his sin, David is able to do one important and central thing, and that is he's able to confess. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. And it's right after he confesses and says, I have sinned against the Lord, that all the wrath that God was planning to do for David pulls back. And God's grace opens up. And I think this is such an important lesson for all of us to understand, that when we confess, when we do look, when we do understand the mistakes that we've made and all the ripple effects that those happen, it opens the door to grace. It opens the door to God's love and grace. I want to tell you a story this morning about my grandfather. Now, my grandfather grew up on a Wisconsin dairy farm. He was a Norwegian boy, spoke Norwegian as his first language, learned English only when he went to school. But in World War II, he was drafted out of that dairy farm in Wisconsin and became a fighter. He became an Air Force pilot, and he flew B-17 bombers over Europe. My grandfather's name was Willard. He was stationed in England during the war. And so he would go on these night missions and fly in his plane. It was called the Little Pink Panties. And we can unpack that one later. It was another time. But he would fly in his plane over Europe and drop bombs on the landscape there. He would drop bombs on cities and towns and military outfits. And that's what he would do. But he would always do it at nighttime. Until one day, his commanding officer came to him. Now, my grandfather never really talked about the war, but this story he always told. It became legend in my family. And so his commanding officer came to him one day and said, I have a special mission to send you guys on today. And they said, okay. He said, you're going to go in the daytime now. And that was a little odd because most of the missions happened at nighttime, but they said, okay. And so they got their planes ready, they suited up, and when they got the flight plan of where they were going to go, they realized that it was to the exact same spot they had been the night before. And they were going to be flying in, though, just a little bit lower. And his commanding officer said, "We just want you boys to see what it is that you're doing." And so that day, my grandfather flew with all of his crew, and they flew over the part of Germany that they had just bombed out. And they looked, and they saw the destruction that was there on the ground. And it did not make my grandfather a pacifist that day. My family is still incredibly proud of the service that he did. But here's what it did do. It took all the naivete away, and it allowed my grandfather to see for the very first time the full effect of war, the full effect of all the bombs that he had dropped, the collateral damage, the innocents lost, the people caught in the crossfire, all of it. He could see all of it much closer than he could before. Today, I wonder, what would it be like if we flew more missions like that over the landscape of our own lives? If we had the courage to take those kinds of flights and to just look and see over the mistakes, the regrets, the sins, the issues of our lives, if we could just see the full effect of them. And then, if we see and look and understand the full damage that sometimes we have caused, if we confess and own it and say, "I have sinned against the Lord." Because if we do that, then that door of grace just begins to swing open. If we do that, then God's love and acceptance and forgiveness is that much more accessible to us. And that, friends, is our way forward. Because we do worship a loving, forgiving, grace-filled God who wants nothing more than to pull us up from the pits that we have sometimes created for ourselves, who wants nothing more than to save us from our own sins, who wants nothing more than to forgive us and to bring us back into right relationship with each other and with the world. We worship a God who wants this for us. But when we deny, when we deflect, when we follow the way of the world, which says, do not at all cost admit any wrongdoing, do not at all cost admit any guilt, do not at all cost invite any self-reflection that looks poorly upon yourself, just don't do that, friends. When we live lives that way, we're denying ourselves the grace of God. We're denying ourselves the love and the authenticity of a true way forward, which is owning and confessing the brokenness that we are part of and that we have done, but then inviting the grace as well. It's not a secret that for those who have gone through the 12-step program, that step number 5 is all about this. It's about taking a full assessment of the wrongs that your alcoholism has caused you to do. It's about taking a full assessment, flying over the landscape of your life and looking honestly, but then taking that step as a way forward into new life and grace. For folks who have done this, they know that there is nothing better and nothing sweeter than the grace that can be found after that. And I know that this is a big reason why this is the story my grandfather always chose to tell about his service. This was the story that he always chose to share about his time in World War II, because it was a way forward for him. It was a way forward for all of us. Today, I invite you to fly over the landscape of your life, to see more clearly sometimes the mistakes that we have made. But then, friends, to invite the awesome grace of God to fill you and to wash over you and to lift you up. This I hope for you. And now let us sing together one of the most profound songs of this very act, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound.